Well, hello everybody. This is Hal,
And this is Melanie.
and we want to welcome you to another episode of Making Biblical Family Life Practical. You know, we had one of those practical discussions recently among the men in our church. One of the younger fathers was asking, how do you deal with your children's propensity to go in for potty mouth, for bathroom humor, for coarseness of different sort? How do you deal with this kind of thing?
Well, I think first you have to say you're
Mhm.
not alone.
No, and you know what? The culture has become more coarse. I mean, I think that those of us who are a little bit older than the young parents can even remember the shift that's happened in our own lifetime. Just as you saw the explosion of cable television that got out of the strictures of the broadcast medium, a lot more what they call edgy, grown-up themed type entertainment. But also, there's some very prominent preachers who have kind of made that a trademark that they speak and use some very coarse language, even from the platform of the pulpit, which, I find that pretty disturbing.
Yeah, it really is, especially considering what the Word of God has to say about things like that. But we'll
Mm-hmm.
talk about that in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk for a minute about just history. I don't think it's kind of like the frog in the pot thing.
Mm-hmm.
When the water gets turned up gradually enough, you don't realize the problem.
Right.
And, when I was a child, even people who cursed up a storm,
Mm-hmm.
there were certain things that they would have never said.
Mm-hmm.
No one would have ever dropped the F-bomb. That was not a thing
That
when we
was
were
just
kids.
that was just considered too coarse, too vulgar.
Even for someone who cussed all the time.
Yeah.
And I was interested to see, we were talking about this earlier.
Mm-hmm.
In 1972, George Carlin did a nightclub act on 7 words you can't say on television, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
That was almost 50 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But just a few years ago, now
Mm-hmm.
you've done a lot of reading by Jean Twenge.
Right.
She's a researcher.
She is a researcher at the University of University of California at San Diego, I believe, and she does a lot of generational and cultural type of research. She's a psychologist, but she and some of her colleagues did a study of books that were published in the United States between 1950 and 2008, which, that was the data they had available. And they used George Carlin's list of 7 offensive terms, okay, and just looked at, they just did a scan through the Google Books app to say, how often do these terms show up in published books? I mean, how are you going to measure this? It's kind of hard, but that was one way that they looked at it. And one of the things they found out was that books that were published in the late 2000s, that readers of those books were, they said, 28 times more likely to encounter one of George Carlin's dirty words in those published books than a reader in the 1950s.
That's a pretty drastic change in culture, Hal.
That's a huge change in culture.
And, the thing is, it's a difficult subject because it is cultural.
Right.
There's morality and there's culture here, and there's some intersection.
Mm-hmm.
We need to kind of take this apart before you even talk about how we deal with it with our kids.
Mm-hmm.
We need to think about this because some words are considered profanity in one country,
Mm-hmm.
whereas they're perfectly acceptable in another country that speaks the same language.
Yeah, and there's terms which are highly offensive in Britain that we just think, oh, it's just an English term here. It doesn't mean anything to us, and I'm not going to use that because I don't want to offend anybody.
We do have some
But
Brit listeners.
but
One of our sons spent a year over there,
Mhm.
and he was surprised at the language and cultural differences even between the United
Mhm.
States and Britain, which have a very shared culture.
Well, okay, and there's subcultures, if you will. Like, okay, I'm former military. The military has a culture, and in certain parts of that culture, it gets very profane. I mean, that's just the language that they typically use. I used to work in construction when I was working with the power companies, and I tell you what, it says in First Corinthians that evil company corrupts good habits, and honest to goodness, I don't use that kind of language, and yet when you're awash in it day after day after day, it kind of works its way into your brain, and you'll find yourself suddenly thinking these terms and say, my word, I could never say that. I don't even like that kind of word. And yet it's something that it soaks in. And so the culture that we're in, as it's become more coarse, we have to fight it, and our kids have to be trained.
Well, but even figuring out what is profane,
Mm-hmm.
what is potty mouth, because
Mm-hmm.
what's potty mouth in some families is not in others.
Right.
We grew up using certain words, and when I heard other words as a child, I was shocked, even though that was perfectly acceptable in their family.
Yeah, there's certain euphemisms that are used for certain bathroom functions or
Or
whatever.
body parts
And oh, that's okay. We say this, but we don't say that. Well, but it's the opposite in other families. And
right.
yeah.
And that's hard to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to figure out what is the issue. I think the issue is the heart. The heart is the heart of the issue.
Right. Let's take a break and hear from our sponsor.
From Affirm Films comes the Kendrick Brothers' Show Me the Father.
All of us have a fatherhood story.
My dad was my hero growing up.
A father was somebody who disappointed you.
From the creators of War Room and Courageous comes an inspiring cinematic journey featuring 5 amazing true stories.
I'm stunned. He's real. He's really out there. This is really him.
Your perfect father in heaven can change the trajectory of your life.
Show Me the Father. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Now playing.
Well, welcome back. I'm Hal.
And I'm Melanie.
All right, we're talking about the problem of the tongue. We're talking about bad language, potty mouth, coarseness.
The heart is the heart of the issue, because it's really not so much about the mouth sounds you're making.
Yes.
But it's about what your heart is. And how this was really driven home to me.
Mm-hmm.
Many years ago, I was at a homeschool mom's night out.
Right.
Wow, this was maybe over 25 years ago.
A while ago.
And the moms were just talking, and somebody was going on and complaining. And
right.
And someone said, I'm just not comfortable using sanitized curse words. And we're like, what do you mean by sanitized curse words?
Mm-hmm.
And she said, well, the euphemisms that we all use.
Mm-hmm.
And people said, what do you mean? We said, well, like dadgum or golly or geez or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, all of those are sanitizing what a curse that you would otherwise be saying.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, I'm just not comfortable with that, because really my heart, when I say those things, is the same thing that my heart would say if I were using actual profanity. And it really shook me up.
Well,
because
because
I realized God is looking at my heart.
Well, isn't that so true of so many things? Because, the legalistic approach looks for the detailed and say, well, if I don't use these 7 bad words, then everything else is fine. And, you see, what Christ says over and over again. It's not the detail of that particular conduct. It's the heart that's underlying it that is expressing itself by that evil conduct. The conduct is a symptom. It is, in itself it's a sin, but it can be actually the outworking of a deeper problem. And so, there's several passages that kind of came to mind as I was thinking this through, that it says in Ephesians chapter 4, to let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what's good for necessary edification, that it might impart grace to the hearers. Okay, that's Ephesians chapter 4:29, and the term that's translated corrupt there in the Greek, it means putrid. It means bad. It means something that's unfit. It's unfit for use.
I think it's important to look at that says, but what is what is good
Mm-hmm.
for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. That part of what defines corrupt words is the effect it's having on our hearers.
Right. Right.
It's what we say is supposed to be edifying people up. Edifying people is supposed to be building people up.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed to impart grace and do good things for our hearers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's when we get right back around to it, that's where we have to draw the line with our kids. To say, okay, this, and that's what I hear these pastors that are using foul language from the pulpit. They say, it's just a word, it has a traditional meaning, but it's a word that is offensive in our culture to many people.
Well, and see, that's what Paul goes on a chapter later in Ephesians. He says that there's certain things that shouldn't even be named among you as fitting for saints, okay? And he says, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather the giving of thanks. That's Ephesians chapter 5. And so, that there's things, it shocks people, it offends people, and it puts them off the edifying message which we hope to be carrying out both in our words and in our actions.
Well, there are people who won't hear what we have to say if our language is offensive to them. And so that swing all the way back around to potty mouth.
Right.
I think we need to look and see what's going on here. What are our kids trying to accomplish? Is it a little scandalous? Is it exciting because it offends their sister or offends their mama? What's the heart here?
Well, I think that, I think that's it. I think it's, sadly, I think in a lot of cases, it's an attempt to sound grown up and mature and edgy or however you want to, phrase that. But in that immature mind, which that immature mind may be 25 years old, but I mean, in your immature mind thinking, well, if I'm a tough grown-up person, I can use tough grown-up language. And so I'm going to say these things which might be restricted to a little child, but hey, I'm a big 10-year-old now. I get to say these things and that kind of stuff. And, and I think we do have to teach our kids, and I'm thinking, my experience as a boy and our experience raising sons, to help them to understand that there are places where certain language might be permissible and inoffensive when the same comment would not be appropriate in front of your great aunt.
Yes, circumstances, when it comes to cultural things, circumstances do make a difference. I remember having this discussion about clothing with a friend years ago, and she was like, if you wouldn't wear it at church, you shouldn't wear it anywhere. Really? Not in my own bedroom? Not in a swimming pool? Not at the lake?
Yes.
When it's something cultural, for example, what kind, not immodest, but what type of dress is appropriate.
Right.
That's a cultural thing.
Right.
And not a moral issue. It's a cultural issue. And cultural issues do change according to circumstances. Morality does not.
Right. So that's one of the things we have to teach our kids, is to understand that there are different contexts, different social contexts, if you will, that you need to be perceptive and discerning about. I remember, what my dad told me when I was a little boy? My dad told me one time, said, son, that's a fishing word. That's a word you can use when we're out in a boat in the middle of a lake, but you don't say that kind of thing in front of your mama. And I thought, that there's a framework there, to say, guys, well, when our guys come back from college, that's one of the things we have to do with our fellows coming back from college is to remind them, hey, you know what? You're not in the dormitory here. This is not a locker room. You need to soft pedal some of this language and some of the jokes.
Yeah, and to be clear, they're not coming home cussing.
No,
they're just coming home with a boyish coarseness about bodily
rowdiness.
Functions and rowdiness and just like a harsh tone or smart aleckness.
Right.
Things that are perfectly acceptable in a dorm with 200 guys and really aren't at home with your grandmother present.
Exactly. So, well, one thing I'd like to bring one more verse in discussion before we take a short break here. But in Colossians chapter 3, there's the admonition in verse 8. It says, "But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice." Okay, I said, boy, those are heart problems, right?
Right.
Okay, anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy. Which I'm always interested in that because we think of blasphemy as something that's irreverent. It's something that dishonoring to God. But really, the term in Greek is broader. It's railing, it's character assassination, it's mocking. There's a lot more to it than being
Even
unholy.
then.
Than even then, yeah. But you're supposed to put these all things, and then he continues, filthy language out of your mouth. And it's kind of like all of these things are sort of grouped together, and you see here's a heart issue, heart issue, heart issue, heart issue, and bad language.
Well, but,
Yeah, and I think that we need to consider that.
I think often bad language expresses our anger and frustration toward the way that God has ordered our lives.
That is true.
And
I think it often shows a disrespect for the people around us.
yeah.
I think that truly that's what a lot of it is. It's like, I'm going to say this because I want to express myself and I don't care what you think.
Yeah.
And I want to be offensive because that gives me a certain power in this social situation. And that's something that we need to be aware of, something we need to be teaching our kids.
In the next segment, let's talk about how do you practically create a culture of edification and edifying words and encouraging talk in your home.
If you've got a topic you'd like for us to talk about, how about leave us a message on our listener response line? You can find that at 919-295-0321. And just leave us a message, and we'll see if we can get that onto the program for you, okay? Again, that's 919-295-0321. So, until next time, I'm Hal.
And I'm Melanie.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye, y'all.
You've been listening to Making Biblical Family Life Practical with Hal and Melanie Young. If you found this program interesting, challenging, and encouraging, why not join us on the web at halandmelanie.com. That's HALANDMELANIE.com. Or follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook at Facebook/Hal and Melanie or Facebook.com/Raising Real Men. This program is a production of the Ultimate Homeschool Radio Network. Join us next week when we'll be back to talk about making biblical family life practical. Until then, thank you and God bless you for listening.